Thank you very much. So, well, thank you for the invitation. Welcome. Hello, everybody. So the first thing is that this is a PowerPoint and I work in Keynote, so some slides may come out very bad, which means that all the mistakes in the presentation will be due to the fact that I switched to PowerPoint. Sorry about that. And then okay. I don't. So I can't see anything, but anyway, so that's my presentation, and that there will be a bit of autobiography here, like anticipating the days I'll be very old. So what I've been doing for years was that I worked on Kantian biology, shortly said, and I published some papers in a book in French, which is a kind of minority language. So, and I did a systematic parallel reading of Kant and biology of his time. So looking at what Kant is saying about organisms and then why he says that in the context of his own metaphysics and the relations with shifts in the biological thinking that happened at this time. And then also for years, I've been working on, in brief, organisms in evolutionary biology. I think there is something weird with the screen. No, it's hard to read, but anyway, it should be larger, wider. And working about the controversies between, let's say, orthodox Darwinian selectionism on the one hand and developmentalist variation-centered views of organism. And so here are some milestones in this theoretical controversy, the paper by Pat Bates on Return of the Organism, Dennis Walsh's Organism, Agency and Evolution, which is a book very systematic on this question of non-orthodox, non-Darwinian orthodox view of organism in evolution, and earlier the book by Ron Amundsen about the changing role of embryo in evolutionary biology. Okay, maybe this is better. Yeah. Okay. So in sorry, for papers. You can see something. Yeah, okay, okay, better. So for some time now, I've been trying to rewrite the Kantian biology thing in the light of what I've been doing on organisms in biology, which means that I'm publishing this as a book like this year called When Metaphysics Meet Biology, Kantian Approaches to the Concept of Organism. And it's not really a book, history of philosophy book on Kant. It's neither like historically interpreting Kantian themes in current philosophy of biology or assessing Kant's relevance for 19th century biology. It's trying to make the metaphysics, Kant's metaphysics, and the constitution of organisms at the times to discuss somehow, which should rely, which should end up with a genealogy of the current divide in interpreting what is an organism. So that's what I've been doing, and that's what I'll try to do shortly here. I'll give you some ideas of that. Connected with something I've been doing recently in this book, which is about death philosophy, perspective from the philosophy of biology, and whose first section is about the role of death in 19th century philosophy. So the outline, I'll first talk about Kantian purposiveness, and then explain why Kant sees organisms, beings or organisms as natural purposes, the criteria to recognize a natural purpose. And then I'll try to look at the reappropriation of this Kantian idea of organism in terms of function, and I'll look at the circular causality of the living, and then the way this Kantian idea has been split between two ways of understanding, one more functional and one more formal, and how it impinges upon our thinking of organisms. That's the program. So I'll start with Kant's idea of purpose. I mean, it's very well known to many of you here, but I have to start somewhere. So Kant says in the first introduction to the Critique of Judgment, which is, as most of you may know, the book on, the third critique, and the second half is devoted to biological thinking, to say it shortly. So he says purposiveness is the lawfulness of the contingent as contingent. And that's, I think that's the key for, it's a way to understand the Kantian theory of purposiveness in the context of metaphysics. So the idea is that when you look at living things, organisms, it's like you find some necessity, but it doesn't seem to be wholly derivable from the laws of nature, which are, for Kant, basically the Newtonian laws. So an example of this contingency, lawfulness of the contingent as contingent, is, Kant says, the internal structure of the animals and vegetables. I'll not be very precise here in my quotation, so this is also in the first introduction. But so the idea here, and I think it's really a way to make sense of what Kant is doing. Some things seem contingent with respect to the law of nature. So, for example, think of embryos. Most of them develop into adults. Some of them develop into bizarre or monstrous exemplar of the species. I mean, all of them, the monstrous and the viable ones, obey the laws of nature. Nothing here is like non-lawful with respect to physics. However, it seems that with respect to physics, this difference between viable and inviable is contingent. Same thing with, if you think in terms of function, so some lungs, you say lungs breathe, many lungs function, sometimes lungs dysfunction, but it's always the same laws of nature that are implemented. So even though both, I mean, the viable and inviable embryo, the functioning, dysfunctioning lungs are physically lawful, it seems that there is some necessity according to which the embryo should become an adult. The kidneys should eliminate toxin, even though they don't. So the purposiveness thing here has to do with the should. This is the lawfulness of the contingent. So more precisely, there are at least three kinds of what should be the case, which are three kinds of norms. Well, Hannah Ginsburg did a lot about the interpretation of Kantian purposiveness as normativity, even though I'm depart from her in many ways, but I have to acknowledge this here. So you have norms of development, so viable, inviable embryos, and many of us have acknowledged and studied the role of embryology in Kant's view of biology. Kant himself has a view of what is development, which is phrased in terms of chimeras and lagers and germs and dispositions that are proper to the embryo in his Essays of Human Races. He's in constant discussion with Blumenbach. All this has been explored by historians a lot. I don't comment on it. Then you have, well, a bear should have fur because like thermoregulation reasons. So norms has to do with adaptation. Polar bear should be white. I mean, pink or red, it might be a problem for them. And you have functional norms, and for the eye, vision is the norm. There are eyes that don't see, but vision is the norm of the eye. So the point here, philosophically very important, is that a norm is not a law. So natural laws are obeyed, but the heart has the function of pumping blood, but a given heart may not pump blood. So a norm may not be fulfilled. So this is like the necessity of the lawfulness of the contingent as contingent is this idea of norm that could or could not be respected, but still there is some sense of lawfulness here. In the Critique of Judgment, Kant studies this, and he makes this crucial difference between two kinds of judgment: the determining judgment, where you know the law and you infer the case. For example, you subsume the physical phenomena under the law of gravitation. And the reflective judgment, where you don't have the law, which is exactly why it concerns purposiveness as contingency, as lawfulness of the contingent as such. So reflective judgment, he says, is finding a rule for the case you see an animal. You don't know what it is as a species. You try to find what species it is. So the critique of judgment is about the reflective judgment, a simply reflective judgment, more precisely. And the point here is that the metaphysical difference, I said, between kinds of necessity, the lawful, physically lawful necessity, and the lawfulness, so some necessity of the contingent as such, goes with an epistemic difference between two kinds of judgment, the determining judgment and the reflective judgment. So actually, it means that the question of purposiveness has to do with the general metaphysical question of contingency and necessity. And I think what I try to do in my interpretations is I try to see how the metaphysical interrogation by Kant is the resource of his questioning of purposiveness. So it's not about interpreting what biologists do, it's starting from a question on necessity and contingency, and then meeting what biologists like Blumenbach, like Buffon, like Kaspar Wolf at his time were doing. So the purposiveness is the lawfulness of the contingent as contingent means that you have here a necessity. Lawfulness is a kind of necessity. That is irreducible to logical necessity and to physical necessity, that are the two necessities you find in the Critique of Pure Reason. So, well, actually, in my interpretation, I started with the first place in Kant's work where you have this question of the necessity, which is the only possible argument for demonstration of the existence of God, which is a text from 1763, where he gives you the radical proof of the existence of God that he will abandon 20 years later, without explaining why. And in this text, he makes a difference between what he calls a necessary order of nature, which might be understood as purposiveness as a system, versus the contingent order of nature. So purposiveness as technique. So the difference here is that the system means that you find an order somewhere, and an ordered phenomenon. And actually this order, like the fact that the planets are all have the orbits on the same plane, it seems an order that you cannot explain, but if you think of the laws of nature acting on matter for a very, very long time, then you can see that this same plane distribution of planetary orbits derives from the laws of nature. Actually, that's what Kant himself was doing in 1755 in the theory of heavens. Technique means you find an order and it requires the conjunction of independent laws of nature. So it seems that you need a technical intervention to do it. So the cycle of winds, the whirlpools, the candles would be example of systematic purposiveness. It derives from the laws of nature. The structure of the eye, says Kant, seems to be the result of a technique, because if the eye, he says in the first introduction, is compound of many parts, all those parts obey their particular laws. If you change something in the initial conditions, let's say, the eye will not see, because, for example, the retina will not be at the proper place. So you need some technique, divine technique, to understand how all those laws have been combined and to make the eye possible. So that's in 1763. Like Kant's, the development of Kant's thought is all about canceling this reference to God's intervention. So rethinking the notion of technique, talking about technique of nature in the Critique of Judgment instead of God's technique. And I'll say why very soon. So, but the point is that, and that's very important, some apparent technique, some apparent contingent order, for example, the fact that the orbits of the planets are on the same plane, actually turn out to be a system. So why wouldn't we suppose that all the orders, even the eye, that seem to be technical, are in fact, if we are really good at physics, the result of the laws of nature? the necessary result. So in this text, I really studied it at length because Kant is really hesitating about living things. First, he says they are obviously technical. You cannot say that all the laws of nature are combined in essence to make the eye possible. Then he says, well, but many things also in the living realm are actually, when you know the laws of nature better, there is no independent combination of laws. Everything follows from the laws themselves. And when he came to the critique of pure reason in the part called the dialectic of the goal of the natural dialectic, so it's the appendix of the transcendental dialectic for the Kantians in the room. Actually, he goes far away into reducing all technique of divine technique to systems. So at some point he says, well, you can say this is technically ordered by God, but it's absolutely synonymous of this is a result of the laws of nature. So he's very close to Spinoza actually here. Spinoza was saying, Deus sive natura, and there are pages in the transcendental dialectic that goes this way. But this contrasts in Kant's development, and that is my only very historical Kant's history slide. What he did on human races, where he proposes a theory of development, biological development, and where he says, well, to understand biological development, you need another principle, which is the teleology. And what does he say with that? Actually, it's the essays on human race are, properly speaking, text on adaptation and inheritance. He says, why is, let's say, the polar bear adapted to its environment? Because all bears have germs, potentialities. Those potentialities adapt bears to many environments, and in the North Pole, the bear will activate the white fur because it's better. So there is a philosophical question here, actually. You have two levels of adaptation. The first one is why the North Pole activates the proper disposition, the fittest one, the white fur. Actually, this is a question that nowadays is interpreted in terms of plasticity. For example, why organisms are plastic, but why the plasticity chooses the adaptive form rather than a non-adaptive form. And then you have pre-adaptation, which means that actually the polar bear has many germs for many climates. Why? The critique of judgment is about solving this why question, actually. So in the critique of a judgment, Kant gives you three other characterizations of purposiveness. The first one, which is maybe the most important in the book, is something is a purpose, objectively a purpose, when its production is only possible according to a concept. So if you think of the eye, says Kant, you cannot account for the fact that all parts of the eye, with their particular laws, produce vision, except if you assume that the eye should see something. So the concept of vision has to be put at the root of the production of an eye. There is another place where he says, well, purposiveness has to do with the extreme improbability of being there by chance. And what does he mean? He says, you see a regular hexagon in the sand, traced in the sand. Well, you know that someone traced the hexagon. Why? Because you know that the concept of a regular hexagon had to be in advance to produce the regular hexagon. Why? Because actually, if you think of all the possible hexagons, you pick out randomly one hexagon, the chances that it will be a regular hexagon are very, very low. Okay. And actually, it's exactly the same reasoning in the case A. If you imagine all parameters for all laws that concern things that are in the eye, if you fix randomly those parameters, the chances that you have an eye is very, very low. So A goes with B, the two characterizations. And the third characterization is that the effect is causally producing the cause as a representation. So purposiveness is where you have two lines of causation. The real causation parts produce the whole, and the ideal causation, the idea of the effect, vision, produces produces the system, vision, but the representation of vision produces the eye, and very quickly said, where is the representation of vision? Well, it's not anymore in God. Actually, it's a necessary presupposition the biologist should do in order to be able to understand what is an eye. And the third characterization, C, of course, goes with the characterization A, the representation of the effect. That is the concept that has to be solved at the root of the production of the system. Okay. So, which is what I just said. So the ideal causal relation, the representation of the effect, ideally causes the mechanical cause. It is the norm of the system. Vision is the norm. It gives you a norm for the system. Vision is the norm of the eye. While the ascending, what can call the ascending real causation part of the eye produce the parts of the eye produce the eye, is somehow contingent. It might be that the eye doesn't work. It might be that one part of the eye is just displaced. Okay, so you get back to the idea of the lawfulness of the contingent as such. And of course, when you say purposiveness, it means that there is a concept at the root of the production of something. This concept provides this thing, its lawfulness. It says somehow, why is it necessary? Why this thing should be such and such? Why the eye should be such that the parts are combined in a very specific manner. So this concept at the root of the production of a purposive system is exactly what Kant calls the lawfulness of the contingent as contingent. So now the thesis of the third critic regarding biology is that organisms are, as he said, organized being, which is not exactly what we call life. And but I won't at all talk about this here. There is a chapter about it in my book. So Kant says you have two criteria to understand natural purposes. Actually, the first one is to be a purpose. And to be a purpose, he says, is first, second quotation is first, it's required that the parts are only possible according to their existence and form through their relation to the whole. So if you think of an eye, you cannot understand the part of an eye without thinking of the totality of the eye. And now if you think of an organism, you cannot really understand the eye without asking what is the eye doing for the organism. So the eye is a part, the organism is the whole, the part is understood in relation with the whole. But however, this works perfectly with cars. You look at the brake of the car. If you want to understand it, you have to understand why the brake of the car. What does it do for the car? So this first criterion doesn't tell you anything about natural purposes. It works for technological purposes, artifacts. So you need another criterion to understand what is a natural purpose, and it is what Kant says. Secondly, the part of this thing combined together in the unity of a whole. They are reciprocally in relation to each other, cause and effect of their form. Only this way is it possible for the idea of the whole reciprocally to determine the form and combination of all the parts, not as a cause, since this would be a product of art or technique, but as a ground for knowledge, for cognition, Erkenntnisgrund in German, of the systematic unity of the connection of all the manifold contained in a given matter for someone who judges it. So besides recognizing Kant's very characteristic style here, you have something which is crucial, which is the second criterion, is that in a system that is purposive, the parts cause themselves one another and cause the whole. Because but in accordance with what he, and I emphasize it here because I think it's crucial, what he calls the idea of the whole. But the idea of the whole, it's not a principle of production. Because if it were a principle of production, you would be making organisms exactly in the way you are making cars. The plan of the car is the principle of producing the cars. So it's only as a principle of knowledge. So knowing, cognizing a system like a rabbit means you assume that there is an idea of the rabbit according to which the parts of the rabbits cause the rabbit and cause themselves reciprocally. So the causal workings are in the parts, but to understand them, you have to assume that those causal workings are driven by an idea of the whole, which is the principle of your knowledge of the organism. And I insist because I think that all the readings of Kant have been just cleaved or conflicting about the interpretation of those terms. The first criterion, parts have to be determined possible through their relation to the whole. I call it the design criterion. It has to do with the idea of design. The second criterion, I call it the epigenesis criterion, because Kant has constantly been in relation with the epigenetic thinkers like Caspar Wolff and Blumenbach. I don't enter into the way he calls his own views of generation. He called them generic performationism, but it has a strong epigenetic component, which means that parts cause the whole. So interestingly, later he says, a product of nature as it exists only through every part, just as it exists only through all the others, is also sort of as existing in view of the other parts on the whole. So this is the design criterion as an instrument. This, however, is insufficient. It could be also, the organ could be also an instrument of art and thus only be represented as possible rather in general. Rather, the part is sort of as an organ producing the part, so that the epigenesis is competent. The organs produce other organs, and consequently, each part is producing the others reciprocally. So you have a circularity here, which is crucial, which cannot be any instrument of art, but only an instrument of nature, which provides the matter for all instruments and even for those of art. Only then, and for this reason, can such product as an organized and self-organizing being be called a natural purpose. So you have the two things here. Organized means there is design. Self-organized being this epigenetic criterion I told you about. This is the first occurrence, by the way, of self-organization, the word in the literature, as far as I know. And Kaufman emphasized it sometimes. So you have to make clear that you have three elements of purposiveness that taken together makes the Kantian idea of purposiveness. First, as I told you, this kind of epigeneticism, so parts produce parts. The organism, it produces itself somehow. Second, well, this the purposiveness, and that's crucial, it's not a principle that drives the production of the thing, it drives the explanation, knowledge of the production of the thing. So it's, as Kant says, a regulative principle of reflective judgment, meaning that if you want to judge about those systems, you have to assume that they are purposive this way. And more precisely, that's the point where he says that the idea of the whole according to which an organism is produced is a principle of knowledge, a Kenntnisgrund, and not the principle of its production. And finally, the notion of purposiveness, so understood, has to be seen first, initially, as a specific relation between parts and wholes, not between means and ends. Which means that, first, this contrasts, and Kant, I didn't talk a lot about that, but Kant clearly as contrast this purpose with what he called mechanism. Kantian mechanism is very specific. It's the idea that parts cause the whole, and that we have to explain the whole based on the parts because our thought, thinking is, as he says, a discursive understanding. So we have concepts here, we have intuitions here, and they are separated. And the consequence is that we have to know wholes based on their parts and the laws of their parts. So purposiveness, you start from the wholes and you go to the parts. Of course, it's contrast with mechanisms. But importantly, this notion of purpose breaks up with the idea of the poetic idea of purpose. Like, I design something and I make it. Also, the utilitarian view of purpose, something in purposive, meaning that something would be useful for something else, which means that you cannot understand purpose if you say, for example, well, you have ants here because they are useful for the plant. That's not possible, says Kant, because nothing can be purposiveness. It's not the usefulness of something for something else. Purposiveness, the consequences of purposiveness is always an internal relation. So when you go with this notion that you have two criteria of purposiveness, the rest of the talk is about the way those criteria will be torn apart. So actually, there is a famous book by E.S. Russell, very old, called Form and Function, and he argues that in biology, you have two ways of doing biology. Either you are interested by function, and you are like a physiologist or like Cuvier, or you are interested, the function is what is essential for life, or you are interested in the fact that in life, forms are constant, like you don't really have the form of constant form of mountains, but the species bear is constant across time. So that's Russell, and Amundsen used this when he tried to confront developmentalist thinking, which is mostly about form, and adaptationist thinking, which is the current Darwinian understanding of functional biology. So the design criterion means, well, something is designed to do X, something should do X, the eye should see. It's about function. The function of the eye is vision. And you have two notions of functions that are most complementary here. Remember, you have the main functions, digestion, respiration, locomotion. And then you have the functional explanation. For example, the function of hemoglobin is to transport oxygen. So this is the function of hemoglobin, and it's the contribution of hemoglobin to a very general function, which is respiration. Most of the debates by philosophers focused on the second sense, the function of hemoglobin, the function of the heart, etc. But functional biology has to hold the two notions together: the big function like respiration and the function of part. The second criterion, epigenesis criterion, organisms self-produce, has to do with the development of the form of the organism. So even though things are more complicated, but here I would say that the second criterion has mostly to do with the developmentalist view of life, which has to do with the form biology, as Amundsen was saying. Notice that in Kant, it's always a reference to the same idea of the whole. That's in the text I emphasized, which is the principle of cognition. So because it's the same idea of the whole in both criteria, you have a unity of the two stances here. You have the unity of the formal and the functional biology. So how you understand the causal circularity, ascending and descending causation that is proper to living things. I wanted to focus on this epigenesis criterion. So part cause, parts causing the whole. You have two senses of causation. To cause means to produce, and to cause means to be dependent upon. The effect is dependent upon the cause. Often it's counterfactually dependent. So how actually can you know a system where basically everything causes everything? So you have to break the circularity somewhere, but if you break the circularity, you lose it. For example, if you kill an animal to look at all the parts, then the animal is dead. So it's not the live animal that you want to understand. So at the time, just after Kant was writing the third critique, I think you can see at least two very important way of understanding this circularity. The first one is comparative anatomy, I'll say more later, and the second one is experimental physiology. So here I'll say a word about Bichat, who was a French experimental physiologist, part of the French tradition in physiology. Wow, perfect. The introduction is almost finished. Okay, so my point here is that Bichat has this book, which is the Recherche physiologique sur la vie et la mort. And he says physiological problems we recognize the circularity of the living. Physiological problems are a circle whereby something must always be assumed, then to be proved thereafter, just as it is from the sequence of questions concerning circulation that result the impossibility for the solution of one sequence of question to lead to, by necessary consequence, to the solution of all others. So how can you investigate a system where everything depends on everything else? And quickly said, actually what he does in this book called Recherche physiologique sur la vie et la mort. So where he says the famous definition, life is a set of functions that resist death, is that, okay, so I'll talk and I will not read, but basically his idea is that he investigates the process of death with experimental apparatus. This is one of the major first steps of experimental physiology on whole organisms, not on parts. What Bichat tries to do, he says, you have three major centers of life: lungs, heart, brain. And when an animal dies, actually it's not an instantaneous disruption between my soul and body. It's a process. So you can investigate this process and see, for example, if I kill the heart, what follows from destroying the heart? Is it the cessation of the brain's activity or the cessation of the lungs' activities? And if I do this, and they are complicated experiments where you have you put two dogs and you put a pipe between the trachea and the lung of the one and the lung of the other, and you kill the first one and you look at, I mean, it's really a Cronenberg movie. And when you do this, actually, you can unfold the dependencies between organs in time. So if when I kill the heart, the brain of the dog is the first thing that stops, then it means that the brain is conditioned first by the heart. And so the idea is that you can deploy the workings of circular causality of the living in time by investigating the process of death. And something interesting here is that if you look at Cuvier, approximately at the same time, Cuvier is a physiologist, a comparative anatomist, and his question is about functions. How respiration is a function carried out in mammals, in birds, in fish, in shrimps. So how is a function carried out differently in different lineages? And that's the key question, and the answer relies on what he called the principle of the conditions of existence. Everything in organisms is such that the animal can exist in its environment. So Cuvier says it corresponds to what was used to be named the final causes. It's a principle of judgment. It's exactly what Kant called a regulative principle of reflective judgment. I use this principle to make sense of the functions of the parts of the organism in the organisms. And thus, this principle allows you to characterize a norm of the living. What does a tooth in the organisms do? Explains why it's here. And it tells you when the tooth is not doing what it should do, for example, when it's broken. And it translates, this principle translates into the principle of the correlation of parts. So if the animal exists, parts should be correlated in some specific way, which allowed Cuvier, this is not Cuvier, to reconstruct dinosaurs based on one bone. I mean, that's what he says, the idealized, but actually that's the principle. If a dinosaur, a carnivore has a canine teeth, then it should have a molar teeth to be able to crush the food. Then it should have eyes to be able to locate the food. It should have specific legs to run after the food, and so on. So this is correlation of parts, and the principle allows you to reconstitute the whole of the dinosaur, assuming that the dinosaur is a form of life, a carnivore, for example. So here is what I wanted to say. I think that what goes on with Cuvier first, and on the other hand, Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, who was another comparative anatomist, is the dismantling of the link between the design and the epigenesis criterion. So the functional criterion of design and the epigenesis criterion, which is centered on forms. So Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, in philosophy and anatomy, comes up with a new principle, a new kind of regulative principle, actually, which he called the principle of the connection of parts, which means that if you study animals, you have to look not at the parts, but at their connection. So not at the vertebra, but you consider only the connections between vertebrae. And that allows you actually to show that this is constant across the living. So the scheme of connection, for example, famously is the same among vertebrates and among arthropods. So Cuvier said, a shrimp is like a vertebrate lives outside its spine, a shrimp lives inside its spine. But it's the same scheme of connection between elements of the spine or between elements of the carapace of the. Okay, so first thing I wanted to say, what goes on after this philosophical thinking by Kant, I think I'm almost done. You have new epistemic objects. So the new biology, the term has been shaped, coined in 1800, arises with at least three kinds of epistemic objects: the Cuvierian embranchement, the form of life, which is a circular totality of parts allowing the existence of the animal in its environment, the sequence of partial deaths investigated by Bichat, and the connection scheme investigated by Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. All those objects didn't exist just before this time. And what goes on them is a great separation between the two Kantian ideas. So there was a major controversy in 1830 that talks about, like famously, to Huneman in the museum in Paris. And Cuvier was arguing that, well, Geoffroy was arguing that if you look at the scheme of connection, all the animals are on the same plane. So it's a unity of type. And Cuvier was saying, no, if you look at forms of life, actually you cannot turn a carnivore into a herbivore, or you cannot turn more precisely a vertebrate into a worm, because you would have to, at some point, you tweak all the parts, and at some point, one of the parts is not functional at all. So you cannot continuously go from the vertebrate to the worms or to the mollusks. So Geoffroy makes possible, of course, evolution, because there is a unity of type, and Cuvier doesn't. So the point is that the Geoffroy and Cuvier, they develop one unique concept, which is the natural purpose, design, epigenesis criteria. But here they are parting ways. I mean, Cuvier and Geoffroy are having very different conclusions. Unity of the living on the one hand, there are and should be only four embranchement ways of forms of life on the other hand. So this is Darwin. Well, this is the issue with the PowerPoint. But anyway, that's summary of chapter 6 in the origin. So I summarize the summary. Darwin says you have two great laws of life. The two great laws of life are the unity of type, so it's Cuvier, Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, there is only one type, and the principle of the condition of existence. This is Cuvier. And then he says, okay, which is the most important? And he says, well, actually the conditions of existence, this is natural selection. It's externalist. If you want to understand the polar bear, look at its environment. It imposes constraints on its existence realized by natural selection. The unity of type, this is common descent. I can look here on the board, but my hand and the shark fin are the same. They are the same part descending from the same vertebrate. Okay. So, and Darwin says natural selection actually rules common descent. That's most important because all the things that the unity of type, it's parts that are the same because of common descent. But it's common descent from an organ that arises initially by natural selection. So natural selection rules everything. And Amundsen says in the 2011 paper, this is favoring that Darwin does here, adaptation or selection, that's the same thing, over homology. This is the orthodox Darwinian view. The alternative people who want to push for form or for development are favoring homology over adaptation. And they cannot be reconciled. And so you end up with two views of organism, and then I'll be done. Either you are a Darwinian and you think your organism as a set of trade-offs between adaptations, a bundle of adaptations, said Huxley. And so it's adaptationist, and one say, but adaptation is never perfect. So it's adaptation mitigated by trade-offs, because I cannot optimize all organs separately. So this is what the design criterion according to Kant, and it's naturalized by reference to natural selection. or you think that the organism is a set of constraints, and Gould and Lewontin, in a famous critique of adaptationism, use the German, so the Kantian-inspired transcendental morphology tradition, Bauplan, to name this set of constraints. And then homology of form is first, and it's naturalized through, like, the self-organization models. So the thing that was one, the two criteria, because Kant was a transcendental thinker, and because he saw this idea of the whole that governs the prediction of the organism only as something, a precipitation of our judgment, becomes cleaved, becomes separated, because you have two ways of naturalize that, either natural selection on one hand, or lots of models that are that are often relying on self-organization. And so the last question was about how to understand this cleavage. Are those views, like, there is the rider here, like an Necker cube, you can see it one way or the other way, but not both ways at the same time? Or are they complementary? Or is one view ultimately deriving from the other, as, for example, each proponent of one view would argue about his own view? Thank you. Sorry for being too long.